5 people in.
Very good. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this latest lecture organized by Reclaim the Enlightenment. Brian Kelly is going to speak to us on framing Irish complicity in transatlantic slavery. And it's very appropriate that he should do so on 2 grounds. This is also actually part of the delayed festival to mark the 250th anniversary of the birth of Mary Ann McCracken, who of course was a celebrated opponent of slavery. And the second ground is Brian's absolute expertise in the subject. He's an award-winning historian of race and labor in the United States. He's a reader in history at Queen's. He's formerly director of the After Slavery Project, and he has published extensively on abolitionism, slave emancipation in the Atlantic world, on Irish immigration and the race question, and on racial antagonism and class politics in the 19th and 20th century United States. I'm sure he's not going to manage to speak about all of that tonight, but I think I'm sure we will benefit from his wisdom on the particular theme that he's taking on this evening. Thanks very much, Brian. Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, John. And I'm just curious. I know people can see the PowerPoint, but can you see me at all? No.
Well, we can see at the side.
Good. That's fine. That's fine. Okay. So thanks very much, John, for that very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to it, and to Reclaim the Enlightenment for the invitation, because I think there's, you know, for this topic, really, there's no better forum in which to, you know, present the material that I'm going to go through tonight. Very honored, really, to be speaking as part of the Mary Ann McCracken Festival for reasons John's already alluded to, but I'll come back to her legacy later on in the talk. Just a couple of qualifications. John's right that I do a lot of work on slavery, emancipation, labor and race, all that, but I usually do it in an American context. So my expertise really doesn't stretch to 17th, 18th, 19th century Ireland, although I've tried to kind of school myself to, you know, to dig into the questions that will arise tonight. But there may be people, and hopefully there are people watching who are much more familiar with the, you know, the material, the detail than I am. And I don't mind if, you know, if I go far astray, if people correct me in the discussion that follows. I have no, I'm not being precious about my knowledge of this subject at all. But it is an important topic, and I think it's also an important time in which to kind of take this up. And so I welcome, as I say, I welcome the invitation. I want to begin really with the context that's been created for a new discussion, I think, about Irish complicity in transatlantic slavery by the emergence and persistence, really, of a powerful global anti-racist movement in the form of Black Lives Matter, which has touched, you know, which begins in the aftermath of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the United States, but which very quickly takes on global dimensions. I think, you know, I've seen reports that, you know, in terms of numbers of people being mobilized, it's the biggest social movement in US history. Well, we can also see not only the size and kind of depth of the movement, but also the resonance that the demands around police brutality and enduring inequality in the United States, the way that that has resonated right around the globe, not only in the US, but in an Irish context, both in Dublin and in Belfast, in across the water, in London and Bristol, Liverpool, as you might expect, but even in South Africa and Nigeria, where ongoing campaigns against police brutality have been lifted by all this. So it's compelled people, not least historians of slavery and emancipation, to have a note, to take a new look at many of the much of the conventional wisdom that's been established on these topics over the recent decades. So even for myself, who was trained as, in what was then called the New Social History, E.P. Thompson, Herbert Gutman, people who paid attention to what they called the holy trinity of race, class, and gender. Even despite that training, I find myself compelled, and I'm sure all my colleagues in the field do, to take a new look with fresh eyes at some of the questions thrown up by the rise of Black Lives Matter. And I think the importance here is that it introduces a new context in which we can discuss Ireland's relationship with the world, not only with transatlantic slavery, but with empire and colonialism. And that's what I'm going to try to develop tonight. As I said, I'm not an expert on the kind of nitty-gritty detail, 17th, 18th, 19th century Ireland. But what I want to talk about tonight is, how do we think about, how might we frame a new conversation about Ireland and its relationship with slavery, with empire, with colonialism? And I think that it's important to point out, and this is what's extremely exciting for me, is that this whole debate, this whole reappraisal that's been thrown up by Black Lives Matter, lands in a very particular context in an Ireland that is in flux, both in terms of its demography, becoming, we're on the path to becoming a much more diverse society, North and South. Some of the old questions and the grooves in which those questions were stuck around the national question around orange and green seem to me to be open to new approaches, new considerations. But it lands in Ireland also, where historiography, the way we think about history, is also in flux. So we have demographic changes north and south. I think the end of the Troubles, the end of the conflict in the north, means that there's an opening up of old questions in new ways, and also a kind of weakening of the grip of a kind of conservative interpretation of Irish history that was known as revisionism, shorthand, that held sway for at least a generation. That has been on the way out, I think. But we can see signs that something very remarkable and new is being born. You can see this, I think, in the comments from Michael D. Higgins around the way that really raising a critique that while the last generation of historiography subjected nationalism to intense scrutiny, one might say, that in many ways, empire, imperialism, the role of colonialism in Ireland has escaped that kind of scrutiny, and that we might kind of redirect our focus to re-examining this. And this is reinforced, I think, by the rise of Black Lives Matter, which offers up an opportunity to think about colonialism outside the kind of well-worn grooves of orange and green. And I was very excited to be a viewer, at least, in the roundtable sponsored by Oxford Research Center last November, which talked about decolonizing Irish history, which brought these two things together, Ireland's own history and also the power of Black Lives Matter. And also enthusiastic, really, when I read that our Trinity College Dublin is embarking on a kind of reappraisal of its own role, not only in slavery, but also, as it says on the slide here, an examination, interrogation, reflection on its complex colonial legacies, which would include slavery, but presumably will have to touch on the role of empire and colonization in Ireland. So that seems to me a very different context that we're facing, which should be exciting to historians, but also should be exciting to ordinary citizens, to anybody engaged or in thinking about, our complicated past. The way that I came into this discussion was through the emergence over the last 4 or 5 years of a kind of an intense debate around the so-called Irish slaves myth. And you can see 2 of the memes that became popular on the internet, which I've included in this slide. One, this idea, if you read it, white Irish slaves were treated worse than any other race in the United States. When was the last time you heard an Irishman bitching, about how the world owes them a living? And then another meme, Irish power, first American slaves unite. And these are typical, I think, of a whole range of memes that appeared on social media, which, I think in terms of the context, we have to be very clear about this. This was a transparent kind of an attempt to counter and undercut the claims of Black Lives Matter activists that anti-Black racism in the United States was enduring, that it remained potent, remained a central element in American life, is like, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. So this whole campaign to kind of juxtapose or compare alleged Irish slavery with African American slavery emanated from a reinvigorated far right in the United States, first the Tea Party and then in the Trump re-election campaign. And then we see an uptick, really a saturation of social media with these kind of racist memes from the spring of 2020 onward. And I became engaged in this, although there were people very capable of countering the myths on the scene long before I arrived. And the most here, Liam Hogan's work, Limerick research librarian, who really has led the campaign against this kind of mythology. Liam Hogan played a heroic role, really, in presenting a model of engaged scholarship where he countered these myths with meticulous research that proved the opposite. I won't go into depth, but there are some complications to the social media campaign that we might take up in the discussion. For example, although the meme was everywhere on Facebook and Twitter, a majority of the posts were actually attempts to counter the claims about white Irish slavery. Anyway, we can come back to that. This was my entry point into the debate, and I would side completely with Liam Hogan and others who were attempting to counter malicious attempts to undermine Black Lives Matter. There were aspects of the counter, however, that I found problematic. In some ways, there were, if you read some of the rebuttals to the Irish slaves myth, you might come away thinking that Indentured, which was a common experience for Irish exiles in the 17th, 16th centuries, but also for English and for the poor among the English and Scottish poor who were sent abroad, you might come away with the impression that indenture was kind of a bit of a breeze, that it was quite an easy experience. And this concerned me. And it seemed to me to kind of hold on to or rest on vestiges of the kind of revisionist historiography that have been developed to set aside or dismiss Irish claims to have been subjected to colonial oppression and to exile and so forth. In Donald Atkinson's hands, indenture became almost, and I take it people have some idea what indenture meant, usually, for white Europeans, including many Irish, but also English and Scottish indentures. They signed away their freedom, basically, to be transported across the Atlantic, either to the Caribbean or to North America, and would serve a term of somewhere between 3 and 8 or 9 years as unfreed laborers, after which they would attain their freedom, and usually a small patch of land, some tools, and so forth. Anyway, it wasn't a rosy experience, and in some places, upwards of 50% of indentures never outlived their terms of indenture. That is, they died before they ever saw freedom. In Atkinson's hands, indenture became a kind of a story of cheerful upward mobility, a kind of a rational choice market decision. And he dismissed, or he discouraged any attempt to compare white indenture with Black slavery, with African slavery, as he put it, another galaxy of human experience. Now, this runs counter really to much of the scholarship that had preceded this, which saw indenture and Black slavery, African slavery, as different, but also related forms of exploitation that arose in New World plantation societies, sometimes consecutively, that is white indenture leading to a turn to Black slavery. But it had by no means been excluded that there were elements of indenture that showed parallels with, and in some ways prefigured the experience of African slavery. Indeed, in some ways, the connection between these two have been considered essential for proving what the African-American historian Barbara Jean Fields calls the incremental construction of race in North America. That is, we have an early period of relative racial fluidity. Blacks can own land, they can testify in court, they can own weapons, they can marry across the color line in the early 17th century. By the end of the 17th century, all that's closed off. And there's a very sharp line that's been drawn between white indenture and Black slavery for life. But this was an important piece in understanding the early colonial Chesapeake. And I think also, from what I know of the Caribbean literature, also quite important there. Sidney Mintz, the renowned anthropologist, argued that the early planters were quite colorblind when it came to which labor they would exploit in the fields. They showed no, compunction to protect poor whites, but eventually they'd take a turn for complicated reasons to African labor. Anyway, to put it in its easiest terms, I thought it was really overstated and problematic to argue that indenture and African slavery were completely opposite ends of systems of labor exploitation in the New World. Now, to turn away from indenture and come around to the question of slave owning, which is important. I would argue that in an Irish context, and I'll come in a few minutes to present a kind of a profile of Irish slave owning. But clearly, it's quite clear, even with a kind of a cursory glance at the UCL database on British slaveholding, which includes Irish slaveholders, at the time of emancipation in 1833 and 1834, is very clear that colonialism in Ireland, that is British rule and the supremacy of a layer of landed elites with close ties to British colonial administration in Ireland, that this shapes in a profound way the profile of slave owning in Ireland. that slave ownership in Ireland also reflects very deep, striking class inequalities in Ireland, which are themselves underpinned by empire, and which have a sectarian dimension, but can't be put down exclusively to sectarian differences. So I'll come around to showing the ways in which this applies in Ulster among elite and Presbyterians and their tenants, just as it does in other ways between Anglo-Irish and even Catholic landowners in the west and the south of Ireland, and a overwhelmingly Catholic peasantry. But there's an overwhelming kind of class dimension. But in an Irish context, this has inevitably, given the shape of rule in Ireland, also has a sectarian dimension. And I would argue that it has this, we can see this both internally in Ireland itself, and also in the way in which Irish slave owners operate overseas, and particularly in the West Indies. Nini Rogers, who's, has published by far the most important study on this topic, demonstrates, I think, the ways in which the greater the distance from direct control by London, the wider the space for Catholic elites to make their way into slave owning. So Montserrat, for example, and other places in the West Indies, slave owning would have included a layer of Catholic elites who are unable to exercise the same kind of political and economic power in Ireland, but who find that in the West Indies, there's space for them to actually establish themselves. We also see this among elements of the kind of deposed Gaelic nobility, and also kind of Hiberno-Norman or Old English elites who are pushed out of Ireland after the Cromwellian invasion, but who land in Catholic Spain and France, and who begin to make a name for themselves and make fortunes in the slave trade, either in provisioning slave colonies or in slave trading itself. So inside Ireland, very little space, I would argue, for aspiring Catholic elites to get a grip, to get a foothold in slaveholding. But outside of Ireland, as we move away from Ireland, it's clear that there's no, Irish Catholics have no kind of intrinsic immunity from the lure of, the filthy lucre in the slave trade. We can come back to that if you want. However, it's clear that sorry, I'm hearing something in here. Disproportionately, slaveholding in Ireland is dominated by Anglo-Irish landed elite with ties to the Church of Ireland, to the Anglican Church, and many of whom are involved directly in colonial administration in Ireland, or have military titles and a close connection to the British military in Ireland. That's quite clear. Let's go through some of the salient features of slaveholding in Ireland. And the source for this, I should say that this isn't, these aren't the figures, and the features that I'll go through here aren't the result of a robust, meticulous analysis of the UCL database. But I think you can glean enough from, spending some time with it to come away with some of the main features, to be able to establish some of the main features quite clearly. Ireland is very definitely connected with slaveholding, mainly, of course, in the West Indies. But in per capita terms, Irish slaveholding is less important, it's a less imposing feature than it is in England or in Scotland, where slaveholders are overrepresented per capita, or in Wales. So Ireland's at the bottom of the table in that respect. Slaveholding is, as I said, dominated by the landed gentry who live lives quite apart from the vast majority of certainly rural people in Ireland. But it also includes, and I'll talk about the geographical aspect of this, elements of a developing urban middle class, which includes Catholic professionals, some of those involved in provisioning of the slave colonies, merchants, middlemen, substantial farmers, and so forth. But still, even if we take that kind of inclusive profile of what slave owning looks like in Ireland, overwhelmingly, it's at the upper layers of Irish society who are most deeply implicated in slaveholding. And none of that, I think, should be very surprising. That is, access to slaveholding reflects the inequalities that exist in Irish society itself, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. A few things, if we look at the map, a few particular aspects stand out. One is that slaveholding is much more widespread along the East Coast than in the West. Overwhelmingly, it's the areas in and around Dublin and parts of Ulster where we have the largest numbers of slave owners. And also, Ulster has the, I suppose, can lay claim to being home to the largest of the Irish claimants for slaveholding. And the individual there is William McGarrell of Larne, who claims for over 3,000 slaves. At the other end, at the bottom 40% of the 89 or so claimants listed here are people who claim between 1 and 10 slaves. There's a kind of a small middle 20% that claims somewhere between 10 and 100 slaves. And then at the upper end, and this is, I suppose this end is thrown off by, McGarrell's disproportionate role. But at the upper end, another 40% with claims between 100 slaves or more. But very interesting, I think, and also, very logical, I think, that in Ulster, we see the complete absence, really, of any Catholic role in slaveholding. This is overwhelmingly Presbyterians, but also people with roots in the Church of Ireland who are involved in slaveholding in Ulster, where, of course, the plantation had been most successful and the Catholic landowning class had pretty much disappeared by the early 19th century. By contrast, where the Cromwellian invasion really left some of the lands and prosperity of the old Gaelic nobility and also elements of the old English, earlier settlers who converted to Catholicism, where that had been left mostly intact. You do have a substantial element of Catholic slave owners, like the Dalys, for example, who are very closely tied to the Catholic hierarchy, who send their sons off to finishing school, to Jesuit university education on the continent, etc. So there is the sectarian aspect of this varies according to region. Many of the people identified in the UCL database hold what Jane Allmeyer has called kind of an imperial portfolio. That is, they have property, sometimes multiple plantations in the West Indies, a residence or sometimes two big houses in Ireland, and also very often residences in London or elsewhere across the water. So although slave owning in 1834 doesn't give us complete profile of what it looked like between the 17th and the 19th centuries, nor does it tell us the whole of the impact of slavery on Ireland's economy, we do get some important features that are clarified through looking at the UCL database. Now, if we step back from a discussion of the 89 or so people who claimed slaves at the moment of British abolition, it is very clear to me, at least, that the large majority of Irish people, many of them, very large numbers of whom are landless or kind of clinging to a small patch of land, that slavery really, transatlantic slavery, has very little or no impact on their lives, and that in many ways, by many accounts, we can see that they are that there's the destitution which they experience approaches, and by the accounts of some observers, exceeds the destitution that African American slaves, for example, face in late antebellum Upper South. So here I've quoted from Gustave de Beaumont's traveler account in 1839. He's trying to replicate in Ireland de Tocqueville's observations in North America, where he says, "I've seen the Indian in his forests and the Negro in his chains, and thought as I contemplated their pitiable condition, that I saw the very extreme of human wretchedness, but I did not know then the condition of unfortunate Ireland. Like the Indian, the Irishman is naked," and of course, this would include an equal number of women, "but he lives in a society where luxury is eagerly sought and where wealth is honored." So even if we don't accept, I think, de Beaumont's, even if we call into question the precise comparisons he makes with indigenous Americans or with the position of African slaves, he's struck by, and he's not the only one, almost every traveler's account is struck by, the huge disparities, the kind of obscene inequalities that mark rural Irish society all through the 18th and 19th centuries. And I think we have to assume, not only from the traveler accounts, but also from multiple official commissions organized by the British government in 18th and 19th century Ireland, that these disparities are real, that these inequalities are very substantial and exert a powerful influence over Irish life. And so this complicates, I think, the question of culpability, and I'll come back at that at the end, Irish complicity in slavery. And I think it's worth thinking about, instead of talking about the kind of the original sin of the Irish nation or widespread Irish slaveholding, as one article in the Irish Times has put it, I think it's worth thinking about the ways in which those at the top of Irish society who were involved in or most deeply implicated in slaveholding in the West Indies are profiting from provisioning the sugar colonies from the port cities of Ireland, are simultaneously engaged in the exploitation of a destitute Irish peasantry here at home. So it's not an either or, as I see it. Either they are, the Irish people as a whole are implicated in transatlantic slavery as a group, but in my view, it's more useful to think about a ruling elite whose interests straddle the whole of the Atlantic world and who are dipping into, profiting from slavery at the same time that they're involved in exploiting the Irish tenantry. And here, I think this can help us get beyond what I think is an advance, in the Oxford Research Center discussion on decolonization, for example. A number of people commented on the role of Irish as both colonized and colonizer. And certainly on a general level, there's something to this. But we can also see that unless we take into account the kind of class inequalities that exist in Ireland and try to determine which layers of Irish society are deeply ensconced or implicated in colonizing and which are being colonized, it seems we need, to me at least, we need to push beyond this. There's a vast social distance between the landed gentry in Ireland and the peasantry, as there is in other parts of the world. But this is more stark, I think, in the colonial context in Ireland. This means really from the late or the mid 18th century all the way through the period of the famine, and even afterwards, that we see that we have chronic instability marked by agrarian outrages, all through this period. And this is most often associated with, the west of Ireland, with Connacht and Munster to some extent. But we see this as well in the heart of Ulster itself, and even in County Antrim. And Nini Rogers chronicles the kind of trajectory of the kind of business life of a commercial life of Waddell Cunningham, who will, feature in the next few slides. But Cunningham is somebody who, from the 1750s and 60s, is deeply involved in making a fortune at provisioning the sugar colonies, the British sugar colonies, from here. He's a part owner of several plantations in the West Indies, although I think by the time his descendants attempt to make a claim in the 1830s or 40s, I believe he's denied a claim. But he's involved directly in plantation slavery, also in provisioning the slave colonies, and also simultaneously involved in the expulsion of small tenants from land holdings across Ulster, and particularly in Antrim. Cunningham's role, and here he's working alongside his business partner, I believe the first name is John, but Greg is the last name at least. But Cunningham and Greg are working together for the Earl of Donegal to restructure the Earl of Donegal's land holdings. And this involves the ejection of large numbers of tenants from these vast lands that stretch all the way from Donegal into Antrim, but also raising the rents, changing the terms and conditions of tenantry on these plots of land. So Cunningham's life, I think, shows the kind of overlap between elements of the landed aristocracy and also elements of the new rising commercial class in an Ulster context where Presbyterians are very prominent in this. But Cunningham's role as a kind of an agent of the largest landholder in the region also pits him into confrontation with many of his co-religionists, who are also Presbyterians, but who are among the middling and smaller tenantry, who he's been evicting at the behest of the Earl of Donegal. And the tensions, the conflict here comes to such a point that in 1770, a mob of steel boys, the Hearts of Steel, marches on Belfast and attempts to destroy Cunningham's residence. He reinvents himself in the 1780s and 90s as a kind of a liberal, but a liberal, I would say, on the conservative end of Enlightenment thinking in Belfast, who sees no contradiction between, proclaiming liberty and attempting to win a kind of sphere of independence for Irish businessmen, and at the same time holding on to slavery and maintaining the subjugation of slaves in the West Indies. That's a very different position than the radical elements in the United Irishmen arrive at. But Cunningham's story, of course, gives us an Ulster version of class conflict on the land that is rolling out at some points with much greater intensity across the West and the Southwest of Ireland. where agrarian unrest is really chronic throughout this period. Nini Rogers' book especially makes a point, an important point, I think, about the way in which slavery, transatlantic slavery, had a role in economic transformation, particularly in growing towns and cities in Ireland, in Waterford, in Cork, in Limerick, Dublin, Belfast, to a lesser extent, Galway. But if we put this in comparative terms, I think it's important to also note the differences. So there are two attempts in an Irish context to actually launch slave trading operations from port cities in Ireland. One is in Limerick, and the second one is in Belfast in 1786. And I'll come back to the second of those in a few minutes. But it has to be said that neither of those, neither in Limerick nor in Belfast, do those attempts ever get off the ground. So Ireland is not, there are no ships leaving Irish ports who are directly involved in transporting slaves to the New World, as far as I can tell. If it does occur, this may happen as a one-off or as a rare occurrence, but it's not a kind of a, it's not part of the business of Irish port cities, even despite the aspirations of some in those cities, including Waddell, Cunningham, and Belfast, to insert themselves in the triangular trade. Nevertheless, no question that slave cotton, mainly from the United States, plays a role in Belfast, for example, in the early cotton manufacturing industry, which itself kind of lays foundations for linen, for engineering, for rope works, for other industries that come afterwards. And this pattern is repeated in some of the same ways in other cities across Ireland, Waterford in particular, Cork, very important. We also see outside of Ulster, where I don't think we can talk about a substantial development, but in places like Cork especially, in Limerick especially, we see the emergence of a commercially oriented Catholic middle class, which will begin to feel its kind of growing economic power and attempt to translate that into political power. And you can see there's some ways in tensions between O'Connell and this layer of Catholic commercial elites, and also professionals, Catholic lawyers and so forth. But there's no question really that transatlantic slavery plays a role in Ireland in terms of economic transformation. But I would argue that, again, colonial restrictions limit this transformation in a way that makes it quite different qualitatively from what we see in places like Bristol or Liverpool or London. Now, the focus on Irish complicity in the transatlantic slave trade in some ways kind of pushes aside or obscures what's a very significant tradition of abolition, anti-slavery agitation, and anti-colonial agitation in Ireland throughout the 18th and especially in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And here, the experience in Belfast, the emergence of the United Irishmen, lifted by the example of the French Revolution, really transformed by the ideas of the Radical Enlightenment. Here, really, Belfast stands out, and here's where the McCrackens, James Russell, and others come into their own. We have accounts, again, thanks to Nini Rogers, of the warm reception that Oladu Equiano received when he lands in Belfast in and around Bastille Day in 1791, where scenes like this in the illustration, there are mobs of what John Gray calls Belfast sans culottes and others in the streets, hoping to emulate the example of the French Revolution with its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, to bring that to bear on their own predicament in Ireland. And of course, this is led in Belfast by a layer of radical Presbyterians, some of them involved in kind of emerging industry, others, from the kind of the weavers and middling and lower classes. But very striking in really in Atlantic terms, the way that the radical Enlightenment resonates among a layer of Belfast Presbyterians in this period. And this shapes really their outlook on slavery, and I'll come around to that in a few minutes. This, to me at least, is the most important, the most powerful manifestation of an anti-slavery tradition in Ireland. I've got about 5 or 10 more minutes. I hope that people can bear with me. I'm trying to get through quite a bit of material here. We also have, of course, a Quaker tradition in Ireland, which is involved in reform, not only at the center of anti-slavery and abolitionist agitation in the late 18th and 19th centuries. They have a host in the South, at least, for Frederick Douglass's visits to Ireland. But also they're involved in intemperance and other reform campaigns. It has to be said that for all of his sins, Daniel O'Connell is internationally known as a great champion of the enslaved. And Douglass in particular, when he comes to Ireland, is excited about the prospects of meeting O'Connell, and actually manages to sit in on one of the mass meetings that he gives in Dublin, and actually is invited up onto the stage to speak himself. But O'Connell has some stature in transatlantic abolitionist circles, including with William Lloyd Garrison and others in the United States. And of course, in the US, the abolitionist movement that we begin to see emerge powerfully from the 1820s onward, with a counterpart in Britain, which leads the drive for abolition there, is deeply informed by, saturated by kind of reform currents in the kind of evangelical Protestant tradition. And this is a common element all across the Atlantic world, including in the West Indies itself, where the Bible becomes, in the hands of the slaves, a tool for challenging their oppressors. We have really into the 19th, later in the 19th century and into the 20th, also a kind of Republican, that is big R Republican embrace of a critique of empire that sometimes, is much more ambiguous, I think, sometimes includes a critique of racism, but at other times makes substantial concessions. So we see this especially in the legacy of, embodied in John Mitchell's legacy, where somebody who is, identified with the kind of radical critique of Britain's role in the famine in Ireland, ends up in the United States an enthusiastic advocate of slavery, and maybe something we can take up in discussion. The experience of the Irish diaspora, I think, proves the point that it's the colonial context in Ireland that shapes in profound ways the nature of anti-slavery and the outlook, the approach to slavery in Ireland itself. But if we look outside of Ireland, we see quite mixed legacy as well. So most remarkably, I think, if we look at the United Irishmen's response to the slave revolt in Haiti, the first successful slave revolt in world history, and also the establishment of the first Black Republic, Napper Tandy and others are enthusiastic in their defense of the Haitian Revolution led by slaves. And Tandy responds to the French repression of the slave revolt with the insistence that we are all of the same family, black and white, the work of the same creator. This is a kind of a very clear embodiment, I think, of the legacy of the radical enlightenment, which had deeply affected Belfast, but which shaped people in other parts of Ireland, including Dublin and so forth. We have others. James Orr, of course, writes a very famous poem. I think it's a Requiem to Toussaint on leaving San Domingo, where he eulogizes the figure of Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. Others, including James Sweeney, named their children after Toussaint. So you can see the way that among a layer of United Irishmen, even after the defeat of their movement, anti-slavery continues, inspired by their attachment to the ideals, the egalitarian ideals of enlightenment. But in other places, there are also exiles from the north of Ireland, who from Ulster, who head to the United States and make their fortunes as slaveholders in North and South Carolina and elsewhere, and who become, even though they'd started out as in the ranks of the United Irish, and become by the 1820s and 1830s enthusiastic defenders of slavery. The clearest, I suppose, manifestation of Irish immigrant hostility to African Americans and support for pro-slavery position is during the New York draft riots in 1863, in the middle of the American Civil War, where largely destitute Irish immigrant community rises up initially against conscription, against the draft, but ends up targeting in a very direct way African Americans, their African American neighbors in New York City. And this develops into a kind of all-out racial pogrom in New York. But I think we could extend this to Australia, et cetera, and the relationship with Aboriginal Australians. But I think you can see in the Irish diaspora the way in which context shapes and sometimes grinds down the set of egalitarian notions that had left Ireland with the United Irishmen and other generations that follow. Let me come back here to really two slides, this slide and one other, to make some conclusions about the problem of culpability, of responsibility, of complicity in slavery. I would argue, and I don't think it should be contentious really, that overwhelmingly it's landed colonial elites who benefit overwhelmingly from transatlantic slavery in Ireland. They have the clearest stake in the perpetuation of slavery. I would suggest that a substantial majority in Ireland, particularly the Irish peasantry, are without any real stake in slavery. I mean, there are attempts to say that, to suggest that, anybody involved in in the fish processing industry in Waterford, which was provisioning the sugar colonies, is implicated or had a stake in slavery. I think we have to differentiate even here between, those who profited from these industries and a workforce that's drawn into, this kind of employment out of desperation without any other alternatives. Some argue, there's a debate, I think, about whether the kind of luxury commodities that are produced in the sugar colonies, mainly sugar, tobacco, and other commodities, whether they make their way deeply into the ranks of the Irish peasantry, or whether these are commodities that are mostly, confined to the middle classes. So in a city like Limerick, for example, the Quakers and others, the abolitionist movement takes up the boycott of sugar. And that's true in Belfast as well, where Marianne McCracken and others, won't touch sugar. But that's, it's unclear whether that's an issue at all among those at the bottom of Irish society who perhaps, for whom maybe sugar doesn't form at all part of their daily diet. Other debate around whether, we have a substantial element of Irish sailors who man the crews of the slave trading ships coming in and out of Liverpool and Bristol. But I think it's a bit of a stretch, really, to assign them the same kind of culpability as those who own these concerns. But we can come back to that in discussion. And finally, let me come back to where I began. I think that the emergence of Black Lives Matter in an Irish context opens up an opportunity that is really has very few parallels over the last 200 or 300 years for reconfiguring the kind of discussions that we can have, both among professional historians and among kind of engaged wider public, about the role of empire, the role of colonialism, the role of slavery in 18th, 19th century Ireland. The United Irishmen had, looked to the French Revolution for inspiration, for the possibility that it would allow an opportunity for rupture, for, retaking up the questions that had kind of plagued Irish history over generations, but which might be looked at with a new set of fresh eyes. So, one of the Dublin branches asked, are we forever to walk like beasts of prey over the fields which our ancestors stained in blood? And I think very often those of us, who are, subject to having to read the news day in and day out in this part of the world, tend to cave into the pessimism that, Irish history, or the history of this place in particular, is kind of trapped within very parochial confines. But if we look at 1798, if we look at the late 1840s, if we look at the period around the First World War, the period around 1968, it's very clear that many of the kind of turning points or opening points in Irish history are deeply shaped by global developments. And I think Black Lives Matter presents another one of those opportunities for escaping the past in the way that the United Irishmen hope to, for opening up new conversations about colonialism that can take us beyond the kind of well-worn grooves of orange and green, and also for a space for a discussion about a new Ireland that can also, follow through on some of the aspirations of the United Irishmen and the radical enlightenment. So I'll leave it there. Thank everyone, and open up the discussion. I hope I didn't go along too long there, Stephen.
Brian, firstly, I'd like to commend you on what was a fascinating talk. I think everybody will agree, and I've certainly learned a lot. I did have a whole pair of questions here for you, but you answered them as you went on, and so, one of the best talks I've heard in a long time on Transatlantic.
Very grateful for hearing that. Thank you.
And just before I go into the talk section, I want just to say that this is the last in our Transatlantic series of talks, but we will be back again in September. Reclaim the Enlightenment does have another Zoom talk on Sunday by John Gray and James Dingley, and you'll catch the link in, we'll share it on Transatlantic and Reclaim the Enlightenment. Okay. So I'll just go to the comments here now for now. Visit West Limerick says, surely it made financial sense for Irish landlords to invest in slavery, as horrible as it sounds. And it was no different for them exploiting the poor on the estates here, perhaps even more so as the Irish were seen as humans, whereas African slaves were often seen as subhuman. In French and German context, for example, the abuse of slaves was just as they weren't seen as humans, which is more problematic for the Irish who know are the same as them. I suppose that's the division of, I think it's more the geographic division where they're apart from Ireland and they can do whatever they like over in the Indies and stuff like that there. What do you think? Brian.
Well, Stephen, I'm happy to come in, but I've spoken for a long time. Even, if others in the group want to come in and maybe try to respond to some of the questions, I'm happy to sit back for 5 minutes or so and then to come in if you want later on, if that's okay.
If anybody would like to unmute and ask Brian a direct question.
Yeah, I'd ask one, Stephen. So I've one in terms of the Irish who were transported to Barbados and Montserrat, and has Brian any insight into that in terms of the research he's done? Because from what I've seen, there were small Irish communities speaking with Irish dialects and upholding Irish customs in those areas. And did Brian come across that in any of his research?
I'll just take notes on some of the questions that come up, and if that's okay, and then come back maybe in 5 minutes or so after other people have come in. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's dead on.
Okay.
Alan Kish has a wee question here for you.
Yep.
As I understand the situation, it was legal to set up a slaving company in Ireland. As such activity took place in England, usually in the port city of Liverpool, Bristol, and London. Was it illegal in Ireland?
Well, I'll come back quickly on that. I mean, from my only source on that, and I think the best source is Nini Rogers' book. And she talks about an attempt in Limerick and the attempt in Belfast. In Limerick, and this may have changed over the 18th century, that may have changed, or it may have changed again after the Act of Union in 1801. But in Limerick, what Nini argues or suggests is that there's a kind of powerful Irish Catholic commercial elite. The Roaches, for example, are the most, among the most powerful commercial families in Limerick, and they're eager to actually get their ore into the West Indian slave trade. But the kind of sectarian tensions in the city itself. So there's a disparity between Catholic economic power and Protestant domination of political power. And the partnership can't be forged that will allow slave trading to go ahead. That's the way I read Nini's interpretation of that. As far as I know, prohibition doesn't really figure in that. It's not a legal question. The same, I think, is true in Belfast. Cunningham hopes to make Belfast a slave trading port. That is, they'll send ships down to the west coast of Africa, bring goods manufactured here for trade in Africa, then bring slaves across to the New World, and then return to Belfast. And that's blocked by, I think it's Thomas McCabe, isn't it, who raises objection in the Belfast assembly rooms. John would know this. John Gray would know better than me, in 1786. But I haven't read of any, legal obstructions to Cunningham going ahead with the plan. It seemed that the plan was rejected by McCabe and others who raised, the question of the ethical, being implicated in the unethical trading in human beings that would involve. So can I just say also on Montserrat, this is one of the areas where, as I say, I'm not kind of an expert on the detail of this historiography. What I do know is that early on, it's quite clear that the large numbers of Irish indentures, many of whom, by the way, up to 40 or 50,000 of them are forced indentures. That is, they didn't choose to go, but they were part of the kind of Cromwellian, transportation after the mid 17th century. That many of them, that there's chronic instability in early Montserrat because those at the top are concerned that the Irish in particular might unite with black slaves in posing a challenge to the island's elite. So there are, very clearly there are racial lines being drawn increasingly, not only in Montserrat but in Barbados as well. So there's differences drawn legally between white indentures and black slaves, but there are also legal distinctions drawn between white indentures, that is Scottish, English, and others, and Irish indentures, who are considered more prone to disloyalty and rebellion in Montserrat. So that's going on at the same time.
Thank you. If anybody searched the archives, you'll see there's a big list of those who received compensation after the emancipation. Is there any record of what happened to that money? Was there in Ireland here? In the comment section it says that in Scotland, people bought Highland land and cleared the native gales to create deer hunting estates and stuff like that. Did that happen over here as well?
I'm not sure in the aftermath, as I said, and I don't know whether this person caught the comment, but Scotland seems to be, whereas Ireland's underrepresented in slaveholding, Scotland is actually overrepresented. So, higher proportion, still small numbers, but, slave owning plays a more substantial role in Scottish society. It doesn't surprise me, and I think I've read some of the same literature that, some of the profits which Scottish slave owners accumulate on slave plantations is then used to help them consolidate their land holdings and expel, Scottish tenantry from in clearances in the Highlands and elsewhere. So, I mean, in some ways that makes the exact same point that I'm trying to make about what's going on in Ireland in a Scottish context. That it's not about, a kind of a privileged Irish society as a whole, which benefits from slaveholding, but a section of Irish society, a very elite kind of layer at the top of Irish society that exploits slaves, but which also lives off the exploitation of the Irish peasantry. And I think that's probably true in Scotland as well. And by the way, true as well in England. If you look at Indentured and Liverpool and Bristol and other places, very often the poorest of the poor being kidnapped off the streets of Liverpool, thrown on board ships, and then transported across the Atlantic. So in many ways, I mean, Peter Colchin, who writes about American slavery, historian of American slavery, writes that transatlantic slavery developed in a context where globally the vast majority of humankind was living in unfree conditions of one kind of another, not necessarily as slaves for life, as Africans became, but as serfs, as peasants who owed their landlord some obligation, etc. I mean, Nini Rogers talks about quotes from a traveler account in Ireland in the late 1700s, where she says that it was not uncommon, that it was almost a mark of pride for some of the poor Irish tenants to have their daughters or their wives called for by the local landlord, to have sex with them. That this was considered in some ways an honor, or seemed to be a point of honor, and points out that this is a kind of a mark of slavery, the kind of submissiveness of a heavily oppressed peasantry, which, as acquiesced in, acknowledging the landed elites as their social betters. This is the kind of world in which slavery developed in, in which Black slavery developed in. So, there's this, we can think of it as a kind of a spectrum of unfree labor at one end and landed power at the other end, but lots of kind of gradations in between. It's not the case that in 1650, most people in England or Ireland or Scotland or anywhere were working as free wage laborers. They could move from one job to another and own their own homes. They were an obligation to some money on top of them. I'll leave it there.
Over the last few years, we've had a wee bit of controversy up in the Lexington Uri direction with the Mitchell Memorial. And with the whole situation, Black Lives Matter and all the rest, and maybe even some of the GA teams that are named after Mitchell, what do you think should happen with that memorial? And the likes of the Mitchell GA teams, the names.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure Stephen, and others will know that the same debates are happening all across the world, because Black Lives Matter really has made us forced us to think about or rethink what, historians call the commemorative landscape. We have statues to certain people, we venerate certain people, and don't mention others. So you have very few memorials in the American South, for example, to people who led slave rebellions. Actually, about a week ago, people may have heard that, a statue that was only erected 2 or 3 years ago to Denmark Vesey, a Black South Carolinian who allegedly led a slave conspiracy in the 1830s there, that the statue was destroyed by, obviously by white supremacists. So there's an intense debate going on in the United States. And I think, for my part, I would have no hesitation in saying that the statue of Mitchell should be removed, and that teams that are named after him should drop the name. But also, there's a debate among historians about whether the statue should be held onto, placed in a museum, and then used as an opportunity for teaching people about the past, about our complicated past, including, the ugliest aspects of our history. I'm not I'm not going to put my life on the line to defend, a statue of Colston or other slave traders. I think it's perfectly understandable that people want to see those destroyed, but there are also opportunities here, I think, for a kind of teaching moment, as they say, that we might take advantage of.
Tell me this, if you don't mind me asking, if the political situation up here wasn't as fluid as it is and it's tense, and maybe if Black Lives Matter had got off the ground more like it did over in Bristol, do you think the Mitchell statue would still be standing? Probably wouldn't, would it?
It's a hard one to call. I mean, to be honest, I haven't heard, I've seen people calling for the statue to be removed, but I haven't, there's a Black Lives Matter movement in Belfast. It's not a single organization of the single mind, but I haven't seen, prominent people in that movement calling for for the removal of the statue. That could happen. I would support if it does happen, but I haven't seen it yet.
And just to probably add that there, in January past, there was a proposal by the Causeway Coast and Glens Borough Council to memorialize with a statue and a heritage trail a man called Hercules Mulligan. Mm. You probably heard of the man through the big Broadway show in Belfast. Well, I was one actually brought to the news and got it stopped because he had slaves and all the census records that can be found up to 1820. He had slaves, more than one. But there's a wide lot of comments here, Brian. There's.
I see that, yeah.
I'm not going to get into all of them now. And there's people from.
I see Julia Wallace's comment about, that it was First African Emmanuel Church in Charleston, which was where Denmark Vesey had been a deacon, which was the church that was targeted by white supremacists Dylan Roof when he murdered, I think it's either 7 or 8 African-American worshipers who he was, involved in a Bible study group. So yes, absolutely right. Yeah, I agree with what Julia says there about, removing statues to racists.
Tim is here. There's another one in the comment section about the Galway City merchants. Have you come across anything to do with it?
No, I haven't. Although, as I say, Galway is one of the few places where you see Galway and kind of surrounding area where you see, a presence of Catholic landowners and slave owners. Probably merchants as well. Probably not all landed elites. Stephen, I was thinking I might send along some links to good resources. Somebody here has posted a link to Liam Hogan's website, which I think people should look at. But maybe I can get you a document with some sources that maybe when John gives the talk on Sunday, you could just pass along the document to people who are there.
Yeah, dead on. That'd be grand.
Yeah.
I think I'll pass you over to John now.
Yeah, I think probably we should spare Brian too much further interrogation.
Past my bedtime now, John.
Yeah, it's past mine for sure. I just wanted to, actually the very first person who raised a point which I think is very significant, that indentured labor, white indentured labor, and the Irish peasant were always, in some sense, considered by their oppressors as human. The key distinction is that the African, the Black African, was considered as subhuman, I think, which provided a specific justification for treating them the way they were treated, and for the enduring treatment and the enduring continuance of slavery, that they were not a fit people to be freed because of their subhumanity. Is there any truth in that line of argument?
Well, let me say this. I think you can find quite a few quotes from, the landed gentry in Ireland talking about the subhumanity of the people they preside over. I think we can find them. I mean, I've read them. So,
Well,
they
course,
see themselves.
right about that. If you go back to the original Irish conquest, right, of the 17th century triumph of the Elizabethan forces,
Yes.
I mean, there's a whole justification of rape, pillage, and massacre on a grand scale.
Absolutely.
Because the Irish are subhuman.
Yeah.
Partly, but well, for two specific reasons. One, because of their religion, which is an example of utter ignorance and irredeemable ignorance.
Yeah.
And the other, because of there are three. The other, their language, which is completely incomprehensible.
Yep.
And then perhaps the third one is their clothing, which is, in the case of women, indecent, and in the case of men, totally primitive. So, certainly at the time of the 17th century conquest, yes, one of the reasons that all that is done is justified is because the Irish are treated as subhuman. I do believe by the time you get to the 19th century, that view has been tempered, but not in the case of Black Africans.
I think that's probably right. Two things I would say. One is that, a number of historians have looked at the way in which Ireland provided a kind of laboratory for empire making. right? A laboratory for colonialism.
Absolutely.
Particularly, many of the kind of restrictions, the legal framework, the kind of assumptions about superiority and inferiority, many of those developed, which you've just talked about, for 17th, 16th century Ireland, are then exported and sometimes by the same people, by the way. Sir Walter Scott, for example, and others, and applied to the British, not only the British, but the French and the Dutch conquest in North America, where they're applied first against Native Americans, against indigenous peoples. They're seen as subhuman, in part because, partly because of their dress, partly because of the kind of shocking reversal of gender roles that those societies had, but also because of the relative egalitarianism of, communal, the communal life that persisted in some places. So I think we see this, there are elements of religious narrow-mindedness, class, domination, a sense of ethnic superiority. All these things are taking shape in the context of imperial expansion, right? That we see at the birth of capitalism, but also, and will take their most finished form, I think, in the way they provide and underpin a justification for racially based slavery. So slavery has existed in all kinds of societies over the whole of human history. But what takes shape in this from the early 17th century onward is distinctive in that Black skin denotes status, and we have slavery for life, and of course indentures, however oppressive the conditions, aren't subject to the same thing. So a distinction begins to be necessary between Black slaves for life and white indentures and the white population as a whole. So don't disagree with you, John. It's a fascinating piece of all this.
There you are, Brian. I said I was going to let you go to bed, and now look what I've done.
Well, I may hang around for a bit.
I would just like to thank you very much on behalf of us all for an excellent talk, which, well, as we note, has raised as many questions as it has answered. It's answered plenty, but the questions are always there.
We do have
the important thing is the debate goes on.
We do have another person wanting to ask 3 questions, John, if that's okay. Alan, do you want to ask your question there?
Yeah, great, thanks. I'd like to thank Brian for that fantastic talk. I read Nini Rogers' book, crikey, back in the 90s. The interesting thing about O'Connell was that what he didn't say was that Nini Rogers mentions this in her book. O'Connell had a cousin in Kerry who owned slaves in Jamaica, which is, and she quotes from the letter from Maurice O'Connell in Kerry to Daniel, saying, "Thank God we owned slaves because we were having a bad year on the farm." So it shows you kind of the contradiction in the middle class. The comment I left there about it being illegal to set up a slaving company in Ireland comes from Liam Hogan. He doesn't give a date for it. I assume it's after 1798. And somebody that Brian would know very well, Marcus Rediker, wrote a book called The Slave Ship, and that details how captains and senior officers on slave ships got they give accounts from Liverpool how they got not just taking people from the streets, but going into pubs, getting young men drunk, giving them loads of money, and then them taking it because they'd never seen so much money in their lives and were never going to again.
Yep.
Because a lot of them would die, they'd pick up diseases, but they'd spend all that money, and then that was the way they got them. Right, you are now in debt to me, so you will now work on the slave ship for a year or whatever it was. And some of them, Marcus, he does very interestingly, when a ship pulls up in, I think it's in Barbados or could be Jamaica, but an African woman and an young Irish man working on the ship elope together and go and hide, and I think they join the Maroons or something. But it's a really nice little story.
Yeah.
Shows you that it is possible to resist even in really bad circumstances. Thanks, Brian. Anyway, thank you.
I think I have an answer to the prohibition on the slave trade. The right of Irish shipping to trade directly with the colonies was restricted until the reforms won by the volunteer movement in, I think, 1782, which enabled Ireland to trade directly with the colonies. And then the next crucial point is, I think the reason why these ventures failed to get off the ground, certainly there was opposition in Belfast, but the crucial reason was they were too late in the game.
Absolutely.
That by that stage, Bristol and Liverpool and Glasgow had got the market completely cornered. They would have been late outsiders. And if they had managed to operate at all, they would only have managed to operate on a very small scale.
Yeah. And there's another piece of that, John. You're 100% right. But there's another piece that I found fascinating in Nini's book, and she talks about, this is in context of Limerick, that when, elements of the kind of rising commercial elite in Ireland were pushing for free trade in the late 18th century, they did so with an eye on trying to, get their hands into the West Indian trade. That is, they wanted a piece of the slave trade, no question. But by the time it's delivered, actually Britain, and not the West Indies, is the main export destination for Irish provisions. So industrializing Britain, which needs, grain, cattle, grain, beef, et cetera, much of what's being produced on Irish farms is going to Britain rather than the West Indies. And it's no longer necessary really to dip in terms of the provision. But you're right. I mean, from the early 19th century, really, we're on the road to abolition. And it would have been a short-lived bonanza for any Irish slaveholders.
Yep. I think, John, we'll end up there. Do you want to just come in and end it, John?
Well, I would just say one word. Good night, and a very good night. And I promise not to say anything else so that Brian can get to bed.
I might stay up for a while, John. Thanks, everyone. And really happy to get along for this. So
great discussion.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you.
Can I just ask if you wrote any paper on the topic, if you can give us the titles?
I can tell you right now that if you look under my name, Brian Kelly, and you look on two websites, one is called Rebel. It's an Irish website out of Dublin. I've written a two-part article, long article, about 8,000 words on Irish complicity in the slave trade. So if you look on Rebel, the same articles also appear on Counterpunch, the US website. And then I published a piece, a platform piece in the magazine History Ireland on, I think it's called Empire, Inequality, and Irish Complicity in Slavery. I can send along copies of all those to Stephen for the next meeting. But if you look on Counterpunch and just type in my name, you can find both of those articles.
Okay,
and
thank
they
you.
go into much more detail if you want that kind of thing. Much more detail.
details.
Okay, much more detail than I went into tonight. So,
Okay, thank you.
knock yourself out. Michael Jackson's put that up. I appreciate that.
Can I ask a question, Brian?
I suppose, why not? Go ahead,
Mitchell,
John Mitchell.
I sort of missed the first part of what you were saying about him.
Yep.
To me, he was someone who was a fairly great guy. But as time moves on, I think less of him. What would be a defining moment for Mitchell? What is that man's place in Irish history?
Well, it's extremely problematic, I think, Sean. The thing that you probably missed is that Mitchell, when he lands in the United States, becomes a very outspoken and aggressive defender of slavery. I think two of his sons actually die fighting for the Confederacy. So he fights in an army, or his sons fight in an army whose purpose is to establish a slaveholders republic. And so, I mean, his legacy is very mixed. I wouldn't consider him a very great man at all. Even, you know, acknowledging what he you know, was powerful writing about the famine. But look, is a long discussion we had, but I think the best explanation is that Mitchell had a critique of capitalism and colonialism in Ireland, but his critique was a kind of backward-looking one. That is, he looked to reestablish a society where everybody knew their place. That's very shorthand, but I'll talk to you afterwards or some other time, and I think I'll probably change your mind about Mitchell. Much more complicated.
No doubt, absolutely no doubt. There is Mitchell is one of those guys that doesn't live up to his own life expectations.
Well, on slavery, he's among the worst, really in the
Yeah.
US.
I would agree with that.
I think that's
That's why I asked that question. So thanks, man.
Okay. I'm
Okay,
leaving
I
now,
think
folks. You guys can stick around, but I'm away.
I think we should free Brian.
Hey, Brian. Right.
Brian's life matters.
you may go to bed. Thanks.
All right,
Right,
folks.
thank you everybody for coming on tonight.
See you all again.
Okay,
I'll see you
thank you
Sunday.
everybody. We'll just
Bye-bye.
close her up now.